I have been playing NES for an entire month, and I gotta tell you that the American version and the Japanese Famicom versions, the vibe is completely different. Like, the one game is much easier in the American version and the one game is much harder than the Japanese version, or vice versa. In this video, we are going to take a look at 10 NES games which were super awesome in Japan, or vice versa. So let's find out. But before doing that, do not forget to subscribe. Or if you want to catch me on live, I'm also streaming on Twitch 10 hours a day, or you can just hang out on YouTube as well. Like, I also go live on 2 different platforms, so yeah, let's get started. Well, of course, we all have played Contra, right? But man, this Japanese version looks super incredible. I mean, just look at this. The trees are waving at each other, and it exactly makes me feel like I'm in some serious jungle action. The title screen looks way different than this American version. Plus, there is some cutscenes and map screen going on. The American version just says title screen, showing you the stage 1, and boom, starts the game. In Famicom version, they use special memory chip. The Famicom cartridge utilized Konami's custom VRC2 Virtual ROM controller, memory management controller, which allowed for very additional features not possible with the NES standard ROM board, which includes animated backgrounds. Level featured dynamic elements such as swaying palm trees in stage 1 and snowfall in stage 5, adding depth to the visual experience. Cutscenes and map displays, map of the Galuga Archipelago, enhancing the visual experience. Speaking of title screen variations, each region received a distinct title screen animation. The Japanese version featured a fade-in with the animated flame on the Contra logo right there, while the North American version displayed a logo assembling in 2 halves, I guess. The European version lacked special animations directly presenting the title screen. The European version sounds super low. It's like do 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 do. It's like the game is turning super old in like 1980s, or it just feels like my ears are aging. I grew up with the American version, and majority of people out there grew up with the American version, I think. But the Japanese version is by far more superior over here. One of the hardest games on the NES, and slightly easy in Famicom version, but the main highlight I want to make is how music sounds completely different in this version. It's like 8-bit versions on stereo. The audio is completely amplified with awesome chiptune. The Famicom version uses VRC6 memory mapper chip, which adds 3 additional sound channels, 2 pulse waves and 1 saw wave. This results in richer and more complex soundtracks than the NES version, which had to rely on the console's build-up sound chip. Music had to be reworked and sound much more less dynamic in comparison. The Famicom version is easier than the NES release. The NES version was made harder for the Western players by increasing enemy damage, removing some checkpoints, and making knockbacks more punishing. Certain enemy placements and boss fights are tougher in the NES version, and certain items placed right before the main enemy's boss fight. For example, in the final boss, if you have Sifa, you can get the magic ball, which simplifies the Dracula fight much more easier than the NES version. The NES version uses strong password system, while the Famicom version has a simpler one. I personally love the Famicom version because it's quite perfect difficult for me, and it is quite superior version of Castlevania 3, aka Akumajou Densetsu. This is one of my favorite game on the NES. The Japanese version of Shatterhand, known as Torkyuu Shirei Solbrain, is significantly different from the NES version in terms of the story, graphics, and minor gameplay mechanics. The Japanese version is based on live-action TV show called Torkyuu Shirei Solbrain, which was the part of the Metal Hero series, kinda like Robocop or VR Troopers. The NES version Shatterhand remove the Solbrain license and change back the protagonist to some futuristic cybernetic police officer instead of a Japanese superhero, basically jacket and jeans wearing dude. The cutscenes, intro and dialogue were completely changed to remove the Solbrain references. In Solbrain, which was the Japanese version, the main character looked like Sentai style armored blue, which had like a blue and white suit. In Shatterhand, the North American version, the hero was redesigned as a masculine, bare-armed cyborg with some sunglasses, basically a jacket and jeans wearing dude. And some levels were slightly modified between these versions. Like in the Famicom version, there was a carnival stage, while the American one had the alien stage with full of aliens and their embryos. The music sounded way different in these stages. I mean, just look at this. I feel like the Japanese version of Carnival Stage is much more better than the US one. The Solbrain is the perfect version in my opinion, while the Solbrain and the Shatterhand both uses the Jalco or Taito's MMC chip, Jalco SS88006 for the memory management. Both of these games are super awesome to me, and one of my favorite games on the NES. I would say that again. Please play it. This game is super awesome out of all 3 Ninja Gaiden games I have played. My personal favorite one. There are like significant difference between these two. The US version is super hard, giving you only 5 continues and no checkpoints. Means if you die in a boss fight, you will respawn back to the stage. While in Japanese version you have unlimited continues and password systems. Plus, you get the checkpoints too, making the game far more enjoyable and less frustrating. Enemy attacks push the character back furthermore in the NES version than the Famicom version, making the platforming more punishing. The Japanese version has additional storylines and slightly different wording in cutscenes. If you're playing for fun, the Japanese version is better choice, while the NES version is more of a hardcore challenge. Also point to be noted how blade you get in the Japanese version and you retain that a lot than the American version. A lot of people out there actually beat the North American version, I would say, but people like me discovered the Japanese version later, and I'm super happy that this version exists out there. This is one of those mind-blowing type of the game, and the most people loved it so much because the previous Mega Man, which was Mega Man 1, had a very primitive control scheme. But in Japan, Mega Man was known as Rockman. Mega Man was originally named Rockman in Japan because of the music-related naming theme created by the Keiji Inafune and the developers at the Capcom. The name comes from the idea of rock and roll, a reference of rock music. Rockman, which is the Mega Man, and his sister, Roll, which was the housekeeping robot, form a pair referencing rock and roll music. Yeah, Mega Man had a sister, I didn't know that. When the game was localized for the North America, Capcom USA thought Rockman sounds too generic and weak for the superhero-like characters. So they wanted something stronger and more marketable. So they picked up Mega Man, emphasizing his power. Despite the name change, rock and roll theme remained a core part of the series' identity, especially in Japan. In Mega Man 2, the USA version had a normal mode and a difficulty mode, while in the Japanese version, there is difficulty mode as a default. The North American version makes the enemy taking more damage and deal with the damage. The normal mode in the American version makes the enemies take more damage and deal less damage, making the game more easier. In Japanese version, password do not save the E-tanks, so you cannot just stock them up. The Rockman 2 title screen had the plain background, while the Mega Man 2 added the cityscape behind the Mega Man. the Famicom version, which was the Japanese version, and the Rockman 2. Both the Japanese and the American versions used the Ricoh 2803 sound chip, but some were slight differences in the audio processing due to the hardware variations between the Famicom and the NES. The Famicom had a direct audio pin that could allow expansion audio from the external cartridges, but Rockman 2 did not use the expansion chip at all. The NES, the USA version, had a slightly different audio mixing circuit, which resulted in softer and slightly lower quality sound output compared to the Famicom. The Famicom audio mixed differently, leading to the cleaner, louder and slightly fuller sound in some cases. The NES, the front-loading version, had a resistor in its audio circuit, which made the sound quality slightly quieter and less crisp compared to the Famicom's direct output. These were the tiny differences I've noticed so far in these versions, but I prefer the Japanese version. Even though the box art on this game looks so vibrant and colorful, and this is one of the best Mega Man games out there. This is one of the Zelda games where you got introduced to the side-scrolling platforming. Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, has several differences between the Famicom Disk System version and the NES version. The Famicom Disk System version used the Ricoh RPC33 sound chip, which had an extra FM sound channel, making the music more richer. The NES version cartridge release used the standard Ricoh 2803, resulting in simpler and more basic sound effects. The Famicom Disk System version used the save feature like the disk system built-in saving. The NES version used the password system since the cartridges do not support the Famicom Disk System style saving. Speaking of the difficulty, the FDS version was harder, enemies deal more damage, and some enemy behaviors were more aggressive, and some bosses have different attack patterns. The NES version was slightly rebalanced to make it easier for the Western players. The Japanese text is more direct, while the English translation is sometimes awkward due to the space limitations and the localization differences. The Famicom Disk System version has better music, but tougher difficulty, and built-in saving which suffers from the loading times. The NES version has a lower audio quality, but it's much easier and uses password instead of saving, but runs faster without loading screens. I have personally never beat Zelda 2, but I might prefer the American version than the Japanese version at this time, but software-wise, Japanese one is superior. The game known as Super Mario Bros. 2 in the USA is completely different from its Japanese counterpart. In Japan, Super Mario Bros. 2 was released in 1986 as a direct sequel to the original Super Mario Bros. On the Famicom Disk System. It used the same graphics and engine, but featured much more harder levels, new enemy patterns, wind mechanics, and even a poisonous mushroom that could harm the player. The game was designed for players who mastered the first Super Mario Bros., making it notoriously difficult. Unlike later versions, the original Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan did not introduce Luigi's higher jump and lower traction. These changes were added in the re-releases. In contrast, Super Mario Bros. 2 released in USA in 1998 was an entirely different game. Instead of being a direct sequel, it was actually a reskinned version of Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic, a completely unrelated game developed by Nintendo. The USA version introduced new mechanics such as picking up and throwing enemies, vertical platforming, and ability to play with the different characters, each with the unique abilities. Mario was balanced, Luigi was higher jumper, Peach could float, and Toad was faster. The game was significantly easier than the Japanese version of Super Mario Bros. 2 and became success in the Western market. It was later re-released in Japan as known as Super Mario Bros. USA. The reason for these two major differences was that the Nintendo of America felt the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 was too difficult for the Western audience, leading them to adapt Doki Doki Panic into the Mario game. Meanwhile, the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 was never released in North America on the NES. Instead, it made its debut in the Super Mario Bros. 2 Lost Levels in the Super Mario All-Star Collection on the Super Nintendo. Nintendo of America sure made more money by doing all of these mumbo-jumbo nonsensical BS. But even if they released the hardest sequel, they could have still made more money because people would just rent this game more often and probably end up buying it. But I don't know what they were thinking. The NES version of Bionic Commando is significantly different from its Japanese counterpart, Top Secret Hitler no Fukkatsu, which translates to Top Secret Resurrection of Hitler. These changes go beyond simple localization, as the Western release removed the altered major elements including Nazi references, story details, and certain gameplay elements. In Japan, the game's plot revolves around the Nazis attempting to resurrect Adolf Hitler. The final boss is literally a Hitler himself, and the organization in the game is openly referred as the Nazis. However, in the NES version, all Nazi references were removed. The enemy faction was renamed the Bats or the Empire in some versions, and Hitler's name was changed to the Master D, which is quite funny. The swastikas, or I would say Hakenkreuz, were replaced with the new emblem resembling an eagle. Despite these changes, the infamous scene of Hitler's head exploding upon defeat remained in the Western release. The original Japanese version was titled Top Secret Hitler no Fukkatsu, directly referencing the Hitler. The NES version was renamed Bionic Commando, likely to avoid controversies. Japanese version was completely uncensored in this regard for the NES era, and I actually kind of feel like the Japanese version is super better because I can feel badass by just killing this bad dictator, you know. If you're a newcomer watching this video, you should know that this is the first game I made a video on, and seriously, I just keep on making fun of this game. But when I saw the Japanese version, which was released in the Famicom Disk System version, I was really surprised how this game title screen actually looked. It actually said Green Beret in the title, same as the arcade ones, but the character and the layout of the game remain same, except when you die, you respawn immediately. And in the second stage, you see the secret level being introduced where you can just escape the hardest part of the game, which was these guys shooting from the top. Other than that, the game just feels quite more forgiving than the US version. Both of these are really well, and there is not much more going on. The difficulty of this game existed well in the Famicom Disk System version, which I love it a lot. The NES game Adventures of Bayou is heavily altered version of the Japanese counterpart, Mad City. While the core gameplay remains same, featuring the beat-em-up shooting and driving sections, the Western release is notoriously difficult compared to the much more easier and more balanced Japanese version. In Mad City, enemies have less health, weapons deal more damage, and overall combat flows much more smoothly. The driving sections also have a better vehicle handling, making them far less frustrating than the NES version. Graphically, the Mad City features smoother animations and better background details. Though the overall art style remained similar, Konami also altered Billy's sprite slightly in the NES version to make him appear rougher and more in line with the American action heroes. Many players prefer the Japanese version due to its better controls, balanced gameplay, and extra story content. I personally could reach to the final boss in Famicom version, and I gotta say this game is way more enjoyable in the Famicom version than the American version. Alright guys, if you really enjoyed watching this video, hit that like button over there. It's completely free. It will help to reach to the more audience. And if you have any suggestions or anything or any feedback about this video, comment down below. I reply to every single comments and I'm very good at it. So come on, you guys can do it. And if you guys really want to hang out with me one-on-one, just participate in my live streams on Twitch or YouTube. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day or night.